In this video, I'm going to show you 4 different techniques for creating dynamic camera movements. Now, our first example here is what we call animated typography. And the camera movement in this one is very sort of high impact. So we've got very sort of sharp movements. It's not very smooth. And the camera's kind of zooming in or zooming out throughout the sequence. Now, to make this, what we're going to do is we're just going to right click, create a new composition here. So I'm just going to right click, create a new solid here. This can be whatever color you like. I'm just using a light gray. And I've supplied the images you need in order to make this effect. And you could just drag that image straight into your composition here. I'm going to come up to Effect, down to King, and apply the Extract tool. And then I can just drag down on the white point to remove that background. So now I want to lay out some text here. So I'm just going to create some text here off to the side. And I'm just going to mess around with the scale here just to get everything in the right position. I can scale this text up or down, but all I've done here is I've just typed out some text. And to that text, what I can do is I can individually control the size. So I can layer the text to get this really bold text here and get it to line up nicely and sit on top of each other. You can mess around with all the character settings here to move the text up and down. So that's just up to you on the exact text that you want to use. And then to animate it, all I've done is I've just applied an animation preset. And all I've done is applied the typewriter effect to this. And to get it to animate as words, what I can do is come down to the animator. And under the advanced tab, it'll say here based on words. So that's how you get it to animate in words rather than letters. So you can create that high impact sort of like bold impact text as it's basically coming on. Now what I do to animate the camera movement is we're going to use a null. So I just right click and create a new null here. And I want to take all those layers except for the background and parent them to that null object. So now I have that null which controls the movement of all of those layers. Now I want to off center this text here, and I want the text to basically start coming in as this camera position gets to here. So what I can do is hit P on the keyboard to create a position keyframe and an S for a scale keyframe. I can hit U to bring those up. And at the start, I want to bring these back here, and I'm just going to zoom in. So I want to start, say, with a close-up here of this image, and then I want the camera to sort of snap to that position. You can even right-click on these and make them all easy ease. But we're not doing anything special here. We're basically just animating that position using the null. We are creating a camera movement, but we're not doing it using an actual camera. We're just using a null to position all of our text here. So I've brought in my next layer of text here. And what I want to do is now animate this camera's position. So I want it to basically start. So I don't want it to move during this. And then here, I want it to basically move across. And I also want it to zoom in slightly here. So I can use these position properties here to get that right. And then I want this text to animate in here. So I'm just going to move my text here into position, speed this up a little bit here. And I also want to parent that text layer to my null so that we get that movement like this, right? So we're kind of creating a very snappy movement to our camera. Another thing you want to do is also turn on motion blur for all those layers, except for the background. And that's going to create a little bit of motion blur, which kind of makes it a bit more interesting. So basically at this point, it's just a matter of repeating this process all the way through until you've typed out all of your text. So I'm not doing anything different here in my original composition. Everything's exactly the same. We're just creating that sort of high impact movement. Now, when doing a lot of motion graphics and 2D animations, using a null as a controller is something that you would do a lot. It's something that I use a lot. The only other thing I would do is use a 3D camera, which I'm going to show you in the other examples. But just using a null and parenting layers to that null, you can create a lot of interesting camera movements. The other thing I added here was a dust layer over the top, and I've shown you how to create that in the last module, I think in video 4. So you can check that out if you want to learn how to create that. So we've used a null to create basic 2D movements, right? So we're only kind of panning the camera, moving it on an X-axis or a Y-axis. Now I want to show you how to create a 3D camera and create something a bit more dynamic. So we're moving a camera within a 3-dimensional space. So this is the example I've got here of this type of camera movement. Now this is something that has also become very popular when using map animations and things like that. You want to create that dynamic camera movement. So this is a really basic movement and I want to show you how to create this. The animation itself, I'm not going to show you. So the map with the line and everything, I'm not going to show you how to create that because we're going to do all that later in this course. But just specifically in this video, I want to show you the camera movement. So I have my composition laid out here. Next, I want to create a new camera. So the camera can be whatever you like. I'm just using 35mm here, and that's okay. Now at the moment, you can control your camera using these 3 settings up here, or you can hit C on the keyboard to cycle through. Now at the moment, nothing happens when I move this because I need to make these layers 3D. Now as soon as I do that, it'll be controlled by that 3D camera. So that's really important to activate that. Now you can just control the entire camera animation using this just single camera and animating that. But another way of doing this, and a pro tip here, is to use a null object. Now in the next module, when we start making 3D map animations, this is going to become really important by creating a null, and you'll find it much easier to control your overall scene. So just to do this, what I'm going to do is create a new null object, and I can parent that camera to that null. So now we have it parented to that. I can make that 3D as well. I can control this camera using that null object. Next, what I can do is I can zoom into my scene here. So I want to zoom in using my camera. So I'm controlling my camera. Now what I can do is I can combine these two and move my camera into the right position here. So with one layer, what I can do here, I can just unparent this and then move this into that position there. Reparent that to my null. I can rotate this to get my camera into the right position and then go back to my camera tool here. Zoom in a little bit. Maybe rotate this around this axis again. So something like this. I'm going to create a orientation here and a position. I'm going to go across on my timeline, create another 2 keyframes here. And then just animate these up. Move this one back like this, bring this up again. So I can create this sort of 3D camera movement, something like this. I can even take those, I can make them easy ease. That'll help smooth out that animation. I can even drag this out like this. And it's just a matter of then refining this animation. So I'm using this null as a controller, which I find is much easier than using the 3D camera to get that position correct. So I can use that to create that sort of dynamic camera movement. Something else you can also do is if you go into the graph editor, I can now control those by giving them, say, a slight curve on the graph. That's going to give this more of a speed ramp effect in the movement. I know a lot of people struggle to use 3D cameras because they struggle to get the movement. Using a null can be really helpful in this particular case. In this next example, we've got this 3D map animation and the camera is sort of gliding across our map. I'm going to show you how to make this exact map animation in the next module. So we're just focusing on the camera movement here. I've just got my layers set out here. I've got my animation playing out. I've made all the layers 3D and now I can create a camera. I can set this to be 35 is fine. And I can also create a new null. So in this case, I want to combine creating keyframes in both of the camera and the null object to create the movement. But I want to also show you how to create multiple keyframes and smooth them out. So this is another problem that I find that people run into all the time, is creating smooth camera movements when creating keyframe changes. So let's just start by hitting C to zoom in on our map here. And then I can pan across, and I want to start somewhere over here. I'm going to create a position and a point of interest keyframe that'll allow us to record the camera's position. I'm going to create another 2 about here. Now with the first ones, what I want to do is have a slow zoom here at the start. So I'm going to pan back and I'm going to pan across on my map. So all we've done is just create this movement, so something like this. Then I want my camera to basically pan across the map as it's moving. So what we can do is move our camera across here. So as this is moving across, I want it to follow. I'm just going to move this down like this. I'm also going to zoom in a little bit here. And if I go to this tool here, which is my sort of orbital around tool, I can give this a very slight, create a very slight angle on this. So this creates a little bit of that dynamic sort of movement of the camera panning down and then going sort of on an angle, which can be really kind of interesting. And then as this is panning across, I want to continue my camera panning. And again, I can give this more. I can even zoom in more onto this animation. So something that looks like this. Now at the same time this is all going on, also want to use my null to create a bit of rotation. So what I can do here is bring up my null, and I need to I want to position this in the middle of my map and then make this a 3D layer. So I need to position it there, and I want to parent my camera to that null. And then under the transform properties, I can give this a little bit of Z rotation. So I'm going to create a keyframe there, go across on my composition, and then also add a little bit of Z rotation there. So this is showing you how I can double up to get more interesting camera movements. Now, if I just play through this, you can see that we've got that animation, but look closely at the movement of the camera. Notice how it's not very smooth. It kind of zooms in and then stops and starts. Now, this is a really common problem when dealing with 3D cameras, and it happens because you're creating different keyframes. Now, in the last example, we only created 2 keyframes, so there's no way in between that for it to be sort of stop and start. Whereas here we've created keyframes, we're going to have that stop and start motion. So the way we get around this is by using the graph editor. Now I have a great video which I've also put in the private Facebook group, and you can check that out, but it talks exactly about this problem and how to get around it. But I'm going to show you in this video, just demonstrate how to do it in this circumstance. So what I need to do is make these easy E's. Now if I go to the graph editor, this represents speed here over time. Now we can see that the velocities, what's happening is it's basically stopping and starting. So it's basically going down to 0 and then starting again. Now if I just took, say, the position here, I want to try and smooth these out. If I drag up, notice how we get that break in the line. We don't want that. So what I can do is I can basically select all these, go to my keyframe interpolation, and I need to make sure my temporal interpolation is set to continuous Bezier. Now what that does is, back in the graph editor, when I select that layer, it joins those lines together so that it creates a smoother in and out animation. Now what I need to do is, if I drag up and down on these, it'll help smooth out that entire animation. I need to do it for all of these by dragging up. I'm holding shift as well to make sure that they're always in the same position. It's something that's like this. Now when I play through, watch what happens to the animation before and after. So before we have that jittery motion, and after we have a very smooth continuous camera movement. So this is how you combat that problem. It's a problem that you're always going to run into when dealing with 3D cameras, or even just keyframing in general. And the way you get around it is you do this inside your graph editor. Now again, I recommend checking out that video. This is a very popular question that I get across all of my content on YouTube and in previous courses. So definitely watch that video to help better understand this problem. Now in the last example here, I want to show you how we can take our animation and then add depth of field. So depth of field again is something that you want to add to your animations when using 3D cameras because it just makes it look much more realistic. Now you can see when I come down here under the camera options, you can see that we have depth of field is turned on. If I turn that off, you'll see what it looks like without depth of field and with depth of field on. It just makes your animation much more interesting and really draws the eye. It really draws the attention of the viewer to a specific point. Another thing you also want to do with your depth of field is if I turn this off, once you turn depth of field on, you can control the position of where that depth of field is on your map. So you're basically using this to pinpoint exactly where that is. And I can also control how much blur by dragging up or down on this aperture. So what you need to do is set the focal distance so that when your animation moves, you can control where that focal plane is. So you want to make sure it's always staying in that exact position as the camera is moving through your scene. So as we're moving through, you can create multiple points for this. We're just trying to keep that point always in focus. Now again, as you can see before and after, just how much difference using this effect can really make to your videos. So there's 4 different examples of how we can create camera movements inside of After Effects. Now throughout the remainder of this course, as we start diving more into animations, we're going to be using a lot more 3D cameras and using nulls to create camera movement. So we're going to be looking at all of these individually a lot more detail. Now the best way to learn is just to drop some footage in a timeline and then mess around using the keyframe editor for your camera and null. Now if you have any questions on this particular video or any of the other videos in this module, then don't hesitate to let me know.